Hello everyone. In the recently held 550 forum aiming towards a more resilient Tibetan community, one of the most debated topics discussed was the Tibetan basic education policy. The Tibetan basic education policy was formulated by the Department of Education of Central Tibetan Administration in the year 2004, and thereafter it was duly approved by the Tibetan Parliament in exile in September 2004. Let us talk more on the subject as we have a special guest here today, Professor Ramu Manivannan, who is a staunch believer as well as an advocate of the policy. Professor Manivannan has been closely associated with the policy ever since its introduction in 2004, as well as he is also on the advisory board of members for a very long time. Professor Manivannan is also a writer and head of the Department of Politics and Public Administration in Madras University. So Professor, I have few questions to ask you on the subject, and my first question to you, sir, is based on the essence of basic education policy, how relevant do you find this policy is for Tibetans in exile currently, considering the current situation of Tibet?
I think about this policy is not only relevant taking into the current situation of the Tibet as well as the Tibetans in exile. This policy has been taken in view of the what is good about education system, education methodology, and about like curriculum and for all children. And so only in this situation it happens to be the Tibetan children. And what is the right way of education, what is the right approach to education is that the basic education policy has certain basic principles and orientation, and which I think it is very universal values about the relationship between a child and a family, a culture, a nation and a community. So it is taken in a much holistic perspective about this entire basic education policy, and I therefore think like the Tibetan community in exile particularly does stand to gain from remarkable insights that came that flown through the guidelines and vision of His Holiness Dalai Lama and the leadership of that particular period that had been brought in Venerable Samdong Rinpoche, and so in such a way that this is a very integrative of the Tibet per se of cultural vision, and because it has in it the components of a culture, society and historical and heritage, and so all these aspects has gone into making that basic education policy.
Sir, so you have an in-depth knowledge about this policy since you have long been associated with the policy ever since its introduction. So my question to you, sir, is in the past 13 years of the implementation of the policy, how successful or impactful to say this policy is for Tibetans?
Like I would put it, this policy in three phases. I mean, the first is about like the drafting of the policy, and then about implementation of this policy. Then in the implementation, what you consider now as the 13 and more years is about like, in the last few years it has been following the policy itself. And like, I would like to put another aspect to the policy is that like, envisioning and a vision is very, very important to this entire basic education policy. And in drafting several inputs and cultural inputs from various people and various models in the world, like whether it's a Krishnamurti school or like Waldorf model or like the play and learn methods of the Montessori and the existing the conditions and realities surrounding our Indian school education system, and then about like how until then about like how in Tibetan schools also simply followed what the practice in the Indian schools. So like we wanted to kind of like rethink and then about whether the Tibetan children need to have another dimension to this education. So it brings about like another dimension is not one dimension, it is the holistic dimension to the cultural heritage of Tibet. So I think that's the important difference this whole policy drafting is taken into. Then the implementation stage, it's also very unique because in implementation, the training of teachers in India, like whether it be in the northern or in the southern, the Mungod and Bailakupe, or in like Bhutan and in Nepal and Ladakh, in all these parts, like the schools where the teachers were integrated into the training program, the principals were trained and the teachers were trained. So this took about another 4 years actually. So this is a very, very comprehensive thing. Like, when you're drafting a policy, and you also have to see how this policy is going to be implemented. And this is the finest experience of working in this basic education policy, is that it gave us a sense of, or continues to gives us a sense of satisfaction about being engaged with the policy program, where it is not only kind of somebody makes a good suggestion, but also ensures that the suggestion, various aspects to this policy being looked into, including the training of the teachers. The teachers are the actual implementers of this program. And so that way I find about, like, if you ask me whether this is a success or not, but there's a new experience, like, the regeneration, and then, like, looking into a different dimension of the who we are and how we have been teaching, how our children, and for example about looking at issues like violence in the schools. And, like, this violence in the school is not only the children, it is about the systemic violence, structural violence, and then the fear factor enforced by the teachers. So, like, this is a complete reform inside the system. By one policy of basic education, we are beginning to talk about, like, internal reassessment. If reform is a very big word, it's a kind of a reviewing ourselves and our system and education. And another aspect about, like, besides the implementation, is that now we see about how this has been working, the parents' response, then the children's response itself, and now we are looking forward to see the children coming out through the system into the higher levels of education, and notice about, is there any kind of a change that we can see, and only then we will be able to make an assessment of, like, how far this, by assessment, it's not by saying yes and no, but it is by going through an experience of, like, a very unique system of education based on the holistic model.
So you have talked about the dynamic nature of the education policy. So my question is, so there is a widespread misconception in Tibetan community, particularly among Tibetan parents, that this policy focuses only on the traditional Tibetan education system, meanwhile neglects the modern education system. So what are your thoughts on this?
Okay, I think you already said in your question itself it is a misconception. And then it is a perception. It's a perception. Then about, like, my questions is that, can an educational system neglect traditional values and, like, traditional the culture, heritage, and also as, like, the emphasis on mother tongue. And this is a very, very important aspect. And another aspect is that, like, when you say modern, I don't see what we mean by modern. And, like, do we mean modern by our progressive orientation to culture? Or, like, do we mean modern by saying, like, it is basically what we call commercialization of education is seen as a modern. And then when we say about employment opportunities, but this particular system of education does not take away the employment opportunity, does not reduce the competence and the potential of children, and then it is universally, internationally proven by test and by practice and by continuing education system all over in different parts of the world, in societies and countries where mother tongue is the primary focus of education. The children have always performed with an exceptional performance has been there. So I don't see, like, with the parents, I would like to respect the parents' opinion, but we need to, it is the responsibility of the Department of Education and the Tibetan community leaders to say that this policy is a long-term orientation. We can't just see this whole thing impact in a small jump or a leap. It is a long curve. We have to allow ourselves to see about and how this policy is working and the performance of the children, and then the sometimes you cannot measure and the qualitative academic skills of the or comprehension of the children, the worldview of children. This cannot be measured by the market tools. So I would think about, like, we let us not mix the commercialization of education or the market demands into the education system as modern education system. I would think about, like, the traditional values with a holistic perspective of education without leaving behind the cultural and the heritage of the Tibetan system and nation. And then, and along with that, and moving forward with the progressive application of technology, and then, like, pursuing higher pursuits of subjects and learning, which I would consider as modern, not being tested by a market and a commercial standards.
One last question to you, sir. What is your recommendation on 550 vision for strengthening Tibetan education?
I have two basic recommendations about the basic and Tibetan education system. Is that we need to encourage younger people and in the schools and colleges, and to take up teaching as a profession. We need to encourage bright students. I'm not saying, like, the other students, and we are not distinguishing between the bright and the lesser bright, but we want to say teaching is one of the best professions for Tibetan children to pursue as a career. Then, like, we also want teacher training colleges to be enhanced and strengthened. And then we need an evaluation system. There's three things we need about, like, a good recruitment policy of encouraging a bright young children to come forward and take up teaching as a vocation, as a profession. And the second thing is about, like, ensure good training system for teachers, teacher training college, then a very effective what you call is evaluation mechanism.
Thank you for your valuable and insightful knowledge on the subject, sir. Thank you.